so I think we'll go ahead and make a start. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this RiskMinds webinar on managing non-financial risk during a crisis, applying lessons learned from COVID. My name is Eleanor, producer of RiskMinds. It's great to have everybody joining us today as part of our RiskMinds Digital Week. Before I hand over, I'd just like to encourage you all to submit questions to our presenter throughout the webinar using the Ask a Question module on your screen. We will try to address as many of these questions as possible throughout. There are also sharing icons for you to pass the message on and a resource list of other recommended content relating to this webinar. Also, if you know of people who couldn't make it to this live discussion but would have liked to have joined, the webinar will be available on demand afterwards. Now to begin, I would like to welcome our presenter and introduce you all to Andrea Pozzi, Head of Non-Financial Risk Management at Santander. Welcome, Andrea. So without further ado, Andrea, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Eleanor, and good morning to everyone. So thank you for connecting today for the presentation. Before I get started, just a little bit of housekeeping just to let you guys know. I'm going to go through the presentation. Hopefully it should take about 45 minutes, and that should leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end. I just thought it would work better that way. I make sure I get through my presentations, especially since I'm not here in front, physically present with everybody going through. But please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation and going through. So we'll try to make an effort to make sure that I answer all the questions at the end going through. So, with that, why don't we get started? Today I'm going to talk a little bit about obviously the pandemic and COVID, and in particular with a focus on non-financial risk, and talk about our experience at Santander and how we managed it and some lessons learned that we've taken out of it and some things that, that we're doing. So hopefully you'll find it useful. This is going to be a little different for me. I usually am used to doing this physically present, and so I tend to move around. So here I'm seated in front of a screen. So hopefully it'll come out all right, but we'll see how it goes. So just to, I'm not going to spend on this next slide, on this first slide, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I think everybody is really very well aware of the situation that we're in today with the pandemic and the crisis. The only thing that I really want to comment is that we actually put these this slide together and these numbers together a couple of days ago, and it changed, obviously. The situation continues to change very rapidly. So from the time that we put this together, we've had about 1 million more cases. So as of today, I was looking at the numbers, we have 8 million cases today going through. So the situation continues to evolve. And while we're seeing a decrease in Europe, we're beginning to see the pandemic shift to Latin America, and then with points of concern in places like Africa and India in particular going through. So obviously, what we went through in Europe, now we're beginning to see more in Latin America, and of course the situation continues to evolve in the United States. Okay. So one of the things that that was very clear, and that obviously I think that we all know, was, the outbreak really led all of us to activate our contingency plans and transfer our workforce to remote working conditions. And in many cases, we had to implement that contingency plan almost within 48 hours. So with us here in Santander in Spain, we literally went from Monday night, the government announcing that they were closing all schools, to essentially activating our business continuity plan for 2 days' time. So within 48 hours, we were sending almost 100% of our staff to work from home. And a couple days later from that, the government went into complete lockdown. So we had to implement very quickly our plan. Now, luckily for us, we had been monitoring the situation for months since it had started to break out in China, and had been working with our Hong Kong office on their contingency plans. And as we were monitoring, we were adapting and refining our contingency plan and thinking about what could potentially happen and what we might have to do. However, some of the things that we had in our contingency plan. So for instance, we had some traditional roles that we never thought would work from home. So for instance, traders or call centers were suddenly working from home. So we had to very quickly adapt those protocols and those processes for those types of roles that normally we didn't contemplate working from home. In addition to the fact from this slide, as you can see, for an organization like Santander, the percentage of internet access varies widely. So what did that mean for us, like Santander, that we have a very diverse geographic footprint? It basically meant that what we established in Spain maybe could not be completely applied to other countries. So we had to do a global protocol, but adapt it locally. So we set principles with dynamic implementation. So what is that? And our principles were basically guided by three main things. One was protect our employees, right? So our primary concern was the well-being of our employees. So that was one of our guiding principles. We want to make sure that our employees were okay. The other principle was that we knew that since schools were closed and many childcare options were no longer open, we needed to be flexible for our employees that had children at home and needed to be taking care of them. So we wanted to be very, very clear that we identified those employees who needed additional support for those childcare options going through that. The second principle was that we needed to provide critical services to our customers, and in some cases, obviously, ensure that we were protecting our customers if they were going to the branch or providing physical distance. So we had to make some decisions as to how many branches we maintained open, some physical adaptations that we needed to make to the branches because, like we wanted to protect our employees, we also wanted to protect our customers. And we also wanted to make sure that we were providing the services that they needed to have and trying to get them to move as much online as possible. And then the last principle was we wanted to make sure that we managed the risk of the situation going through because this is unlike anything that we've seen before. So we started with those basic core ideas. So as we all know, COVID really changed the way we work, right, from the start. So as I said, we had to quickly adapt our business continuity plan because in the past, our original business continuity plan was based on less than 100% of our employees working from home. In fact, I think we contemplated something like 60% would be working from home and still have 40%. But as we know, as things quickly evolved, we really saw that we were going very, very quickly to almost 100% of employees working from home. And the original business continuity plan contemplated working from different remote working sites. So if we couldn't work in our main site, we would move certain employees to remote working sites. And now we had to think about that differently, right? So the pandemic really challenged some of our basic assumptions that were built into our business continuity. In addition to the fact that prior to this, trying to get the business to contemplate a pandemic scenario was very difficult because obviously the answer that we kept getting was, well, you know, that's 1 in 100. Well, it clearly was 1 in 100 because I think the last time that we had this was about 100 years ago. So, but trying to get them to think through this, that we could potentially have this going through was difficult. Obviously now no one believes that anymore, but as things started to evolve, we started to see that thinking change very quickly, right, going through that. The other aspect was that we needed to adapt our technology infrastructure practically overnight to work remotely. So in many cases, we needed to accelerate some of our strategic plans in terms of technology. So we had originally contemplated moving to cloud on some things a little bit more longer term. Well, we accelerated some of that move over into cloud very, very quickly because of the need that we had. And in addition, we had to contemplate some other types of technology because we had some areas in the bank that had very large data needs. So they needed to either work with data, so they needed to download large pieces of data or send large data, and we needed to quickly implement that ability so that they were able to do that from home, which you wouldn't be able to do through a traditional kind of broadband VPN. So we had to implement and adapt our technology infrastructure overnight. I've already mentioned that working from home was not always viable from some other countries, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on in terms of some of the things that we adapted for some of our other countries going through that, particularly because we were thinking through some of the risks that we had there. And in addition, as you all know, protocols were also conditioned by governance decisions and responses. So not all governments took the same type of measures and processes. So here in Spain, we were literally in one of the strictest lockdowns of most countries. So our protocols were going to be very different than maybe in other countries that didn't have quite as strict lockdowns, and we had to take that into consideration. But at the same time, going back to the three basic principles that I talked about. So maybe a country didn't have a strict lockdown, but maybe we applied similar protocols for our employees because we really felt the health and safety of our employees was primary. So even if the government didn't follow suit, we wanted our employees to follow similar protocols as we had in Spain. So we adapt these things locally as we went through. And of course, in some cases, there was a bit of a lag, right? So as I said, Latin America, we're seeing a peak right now. So we went through things in Spain maybe about 3 weeks before Latin America. So we were able to think about what was coming for Latin America and adapt what was going on there with our protocols going through there. So obviously, the confinement period, obviously our remote work reshapes the risk profile. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more detail in a couple slides, but particularly obviously that this is clear that our IT and cyber risk, the inherent risk increased, and we had to think about that, how we were going to manage that, and as well as fraud and things like data protection. The other aspects were that we had to expedite the launch of new products to help customers and to deliver government measures. So, and in some cases, we expedited products because we wanted to help our customers, right? So as some of you may know, our goal in Santander is to be simple, personal, and fair. So we want to be responsible bankers and make sure that we were helping our customers. So even though maybe we didn't have a government measure in place, we were launching things to help support our customers as well. So we had to move these products quickly, make sure that we get the documentation in place, and make sure that we could implement them quickly enough to really truly help our customers, and then as well make sure that we were agile and dynamic and moving in implementing the government measures. Obviously, we had to go to remote working solutions for roles with special requirements. So I mentioned traders, right? So as we know, traders were traditionally never thought to be a role that would be working from home. But with technology, we were able to implement things like apps like that simulate turret phones, right? So that helps provide us a safe, a controlled environment for our traders going through and making sure that we're not having any increased risk there going through that, and as well for call centers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our call centers in a couple slides because we had to take some different approaches depending on the country that we were in. High dependency on suppliers, right? I think everyone knows that our third-party risk increased significantly during the lockdown. So we wanted to make, we really were seeing our critical suppliers. We were very dependent on them, and we had to make sure that they had proper business continuity plans in place as well. And then we were seeing an increased volume of call requests at our call centers, and we were trying to ensure that people could also get through on our online channels, right? So some of the things there. One of the things that we're discovering now as we start to go back into the reopen piece is that clearly it was much easier to shut down than it is to reopen. So the transition to the new normal is going to be slower than it was as we went into work from home. Work from home went quickly. This is now going slower. particularly as we take into consideration those three things that I mentioned, right? So we want to make sure that we continue to protect the well-being of our employees, that we continue to provide support for them, because still many of our employees still don't have childcare options, as things like schools and daycare centers will be the last to open. So we want to make sure that we're still providing those. So it's going slower and is more asymmetrical. And obviously will be more gradual and will adapt to the country's conditions as we go through. One of the things that we're really, really cognizant about is maintaining the equilibrium of safeguarding people's health and speeding up the economic recovery, right? So we want to make sure that we're managing that, continue to manage that for our customers, and if they have to go to a branch, and protect our employees, as I've mentioned, going through. We've also had to think about how we were putting in place our control environment. And like I mentioned, when I talk a little bit about the risk, I'm going to talk a little bit about our control environment a little bit more later on, right? And that the other thing is our prevention measures and monitoring are critical. So right now, one of the things that we're talking about and we're worrying about is we're, again, looking at the situation in China because we're worrying about a second wave. So if there is a second wave and we're keeping an eye on China and going through, what is it going to look like? And what would be the trigger point for us to decelerate our return to work, return to office? So, and what points, what trigger points will we establish and think about? Because in some cases, like with the last lockdown, we didn't necessarily wait for all the government measures to be put in place for us to take actions with respect to work from home. So one of the things that I did want to mention was yesterday I was in a leadership meeting here in Santander, and the CEO of AstraZeneca gave a talk for all of us, and I noted a couple of things that he said, which I think are themes, and I'm going to return to some of these themes throughout my presentation, but I particularly liked them because I thought they just really resonated with me. So one of the things that he said was that we've learned that we can do things much faster. So clearly, for Santander, we clearly were able to implement very quickly, very efficiently, and very effectively, and we learned that when we all know what the objective is, we can execute on it brilliantly. And that's really what we did. And essentially, that's also what he said. In time of need, we're more efficient. So I'm going to return to this theme a couple times in time of need, that we're more efficient in my presentation. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, obviously, here we go. I've talked a little bit about this. Returning to the new normal, I don't think it's going to come as a surprise to anyone that we are re-looking at the way we work now. So one of the things that came out, we took a survey of our employees in the bank, and we asked them, said, if you had your ideal situation, how many days a week would you work from home? And the majority of our employees indicated that they would really like to work from home 1 to 2 days a week. So that's making us actually rethink our plan for our physical presence in our offices. It seems like we could probably go to a 60%, 40% mix in terms of those in the office and those working from home, and thinking through that. One of the things that we also found was that our employees were incredibly efficient working from home, so that was very different than what we originally thought. And in fact, many employees were working more hours from home than they were working when they're in the office. And in fact, in the beginning, in a town hall with my staff, I had to ask them to make sure that they were setting limits and times. So, have a start time and an end time if they could, because I didn't want them working too many hours, because the tendency was that since you were connected, you were just going to stay connected and just continue working. So we really had to try to manage that piece as well. going through that. But these are things now that we're thinking about in terms of just the new normal. How do we go back to that? And going through that. One of the things that was commented, and there was an article in Bloomberg that came out a couple of weeks ago, that for us here in Corporate Center in Santander, for those of you that don't know, we are located about 26 kilometers, 30 kilometers outside of Madrid, and we're on a campus. So it's a lot of space, so it's made it a little bit easier for us to return to the office because we really don't have high rises. We've got buildings with 2 floors, so we can easily take stairs. We can spread out the number of employees and gradually return to work as we go through because we've got more space. But this is more of a challenge for those companies that are located in city centers and work in high rises. They're all trying to think through as they return to work. How are they going to get employees in all the elevators? What are the protocols going through? For us, it's been a little bit easier. So we're already implementing, I think, phase 3 of our employees' return to work, although I think right now we're about 30% of our employees are back in the office. Okay. Just a little joke because this is a very serious topic, but to add some levity, computers have enabled people to make mistakes faster than almost any invention in history, with the possible exception of tequila and handguns. So I like to mention this joke because it adds a little good bit of a break. So now I'm going to transition to talking a little bit more about remote working and the non-financial risk profile and some of the things that we encountered, right? So I've talked about the tools and capabilities. I've talked about the work from home option. I've talked about the enhanced capacity, right, and how we needed to manage our enhanced capacity for contact centers and collections and branches, as well as going to a multi-work strategy. We had to think about our tools and what we were using. One of the other things that we had to think about was that we needed to revisit some process design. So some processes needed to be adapted, which basically presented opportunities for improvement. So in some cases, we had some manual processes, and we had to very quickly adapt these manual processes to be more automated or use more technology, and obviously it's more efficient. So now that we've adapted these processes, we're not going to go back to the manual process. And we're identifying those processes where we have automated and become more efficient and looking and seeing, can we apply this globally? So in some cases, we've had some situations, let's say in Argentina, where they adapted processes to be more technology, more automated. So we're going to take those lessons learned, we're going to apply them elsewhere and saying, this is a really good thing to do. So we're looking at this as an investment and enhancement, and we're not going to go back. We're going to continue to roll that out. So it really accelerated some of our investment in some of these things to be more efficient and going through that. However, one of the things that's happened is that we're seeing some very specific risks and some increases in some inherent risks that we had. So obviously, cyber attacks is an increased concern. So number of cyber, increased reliance on technology. We've increased our technology risk, obviously, increase in our potential cyber. So these are all potential risks that we're seeing right now that we're trying to manage, and we're trying to look ahead. Obviously, potential increase of fraud and data leakage as we have people working from home and going through and looking at those. So we've got a broad spectrum of all these types of risks. And in order to think about these risks, we really needed to think through these risks very quickly, where we had risk exposure and where it was increasing and how to mitigate those risks. So the reality is, in this situation, we couldn't stop and say, okay, all our first line of defense now needs to do a new RCSA. Can you please do an RCSA? That just wasn't feasible. We needed to be much more dynamic and much more agile and flexible in thinking through our risks and how we were managing them. So we were moving more quickly as we were going through that. And some of the other risks that we were seeing were obviously, people, right? So thinking about our people. And it wasn't just thinking about their physical health one of the things that was really important to me in the beginning was making sure that I kept contact with my team and my employees, because I knew that this was a difficult situation, and I wanted to make sure that they were all okay working from home. And literally, I was having Zoom calls and scrolling through each one of them and taking a look at their photos to see how they were looking and see how they were doing, because I wanted to make sure that from a kind of a emotional perspective and physical perspective, they were doing okay. And it was very important to keep communication with them and keep that line of communication open. So we established a weekly call with them, and it's actually been a very good practice, and I'm going to keep it. I'm going to keep that weekly call and go through that. Obviously, we've seen an increase in phishing emails and scams, and in particular scam-related. And obviously, we've seen a drop in certain types of fraud and certain types of crime, but we're seeing an increase in vaccine and protective equipment scams, right? So we've got these organized crime groups that are out there trying to take advantage, and they're particularly targeting some vulnerable clients or our elderly clients who tend to be more susceptible to these types of things. So we're seeing some of that. As I mentioned, we worry about data leakage and going through as people are working from home. So these are all things that we're going through. In terms of other types of fraud, we worry about the potential for unsecured payment systems and theft of identity theft and theft of credentials, right, as they go through for these scams. And then we're seeing an increased need for credit, obviously, from some of our clients. So we want to make sure that we're also managing the fraud inherent in the credit process, right? We make sure that people aren't submitting false documents or fraudulent documentation going through that. Obviously, working from home, we need to protect against internal fraud, right? And then a couple things that we've seen an increase in the increased potential is execution and process errors, right? Some cases the process is being slower, and because the communication between certain groups that normally work together, physically work together in a process, is less fluid, so the communication isn't maybe as good, so we need to manage that type of part there going through. So obviously, in looking at these different types of risks that we were looking at, we had to put in place some enhanced controls, and in some cases, we put in place additional controls for putting those in. So we limited access to customer information, we did some data masking, we did additional call recording, more audit trails, those types of things that we were just trying to make sure that we were mitigating and managing that going through. And then my team here at Corporate Center put together some guidance on fraud, on how good practices for fraud, some cases, some things, some controls that we should put in place, additional controls that we should put in place, and we disseminated that out very, very quickly to the countries so that they could start implementing and going through that. So those were some of the things that we're looking at. Some other things that we looked at, I'm sorry, before I go to the lessons learned, I'm just going to go back a minute. Sorry, I didn't mean to advance. Some other things that we put in place was obviously monitoring of vulnerable clients. So we put in place some extra monitoring and taking a look at some of their transactions and extra, because we wanted to make sure that they weren't being targeted by these organized crime groups or by particular scams. So we were trying to make sure that that we had extra monitoring in place for those types of customers and looking at that. And then one of the other things that we had to think about was places like Mexico or Brazil. So we're in Spain, most of our call centers went to work from home. In Mexico, we realized that many of the people working in call centers didn't really have the infrastructure in place to really be able to work efficiently from home. So either they didn't have good broadband access, they didn't have internet access, or there could potentially be a risk there because we have some very clear organized crime groups. We didn't want them to be at risk. So instead of necessarily sending 100% of our call center staff from home, there we utilize more remote office locations and remote working locations with physical distance and social distancing clearly implemented and going through, and repurpose some of our corporate center for call centers. Because since most of our corporate center staff would be working from home, we were able to place some of our call center staff in our corporate center and going through that. So these were things that we had to think through carefully. As I mentioned, we had our basic protocols and principles, but we adapted them to the realities of the country. So we adapted them to the needs of the employees and also to how we needed to manage the inherent risk of the country, and looking through that and put in place different aspects and different protocols. Okay. So we'll move. So that brings me to some lessons learned, and then I'll talk a little bit about some lessons learned in particular for our non-financial risk on how that applied, and then hopefully that'll bring me to time for questions. So some lessons learned from the crisis. We really needed to update our test plans and protocols regularly. So as I mentioned, we had been monitoring the situation in China and working with our Hong Kong office very closely, and we were refining our plan. But one of the things that we found is that once we triggered the protocol for the bank as a whole, we still were going through and refining the plan. And we were still adapting the plan and being dynamic and flexible and going through that. What we had in place from 2009 for H1N1 was not fully effective. As I mentioned, it had contemplated not 100% of the staff working from home. We were really going to a lot of remote working aspects. We needed to really contemplate a broader spectrum of scenarios, right? And one of the main changes that we've come to is that while we've always made the assumption that we were going to go to a remote work center, we've come to the realization that maybe now we don't really need those remote work centers, not necessarily to the extent that we originally had contemplated them. Maybe for a small percentage, 5% of really critical and essential staff that needed to be in the office, but the majority of our employees could really work efficiently and effectively from home. And obviously this would have to be adapted country to country. Clearly, we all know that the pandemic situation changed quickly. So we needed to have flexible solutions, and quick adaptation of processes was critical to us. So we needed to be very agile in that respect. Our business impact analysis is a must-have. So you need to determine your critical processes. You need to have those very, very clear, and you need to be very clear on what your end-to-end processes are in terms of that space. Those critical end-to-end processes, you need to be clear and have those clearly identified, right? And then have clearly identified your recovery resources and your interdependencies among the different businesses and areas. And as I mentioned, in some cases, right, some processes we found were actually a little bit slower because of how we had to execute them, and because of a lot of teams were used to working in physical proximity. So we had to change that. And where we could automate, we did to make that available. And so, and then of course, we needed to establish the different business areas activities to establish our recovery priorities and what was going first. One of the critical things that we came across is that it's really effective to operate a single command center. So it's essential to coordinate your teams well. So we had a one command center where we had all different areas represented there. So we had the business areas represented. We had technology and operations. We had risk. We had compliance. We have the CFO organization. All of us in one command center, talking about the different issues that we could potentially have and going through there. And that way we made sure that we coordinated the teams well. And like I said, with the common guidelines, but we needed to have solutions and needed to be able to adapt quickly. Clearly, our third-party risk increased, as I mentioned, and our dependency on critical suppliers. And they are also impacted by the new threat. So it's very clear that we need to constantly update and maintain the list of our critical suppliers and know what they are and understand how well prepared they are for a crisis situation. So do they have good BCP plans in place? Do they have good business continuity, and making sure about that, right? And then the other lesson learned is our contact center was a key service during the pandemic, obviously. The other thing is that we really promoted the use of what we call channel deflection techniques. So could we get people to go online and use a chat as opposed to dialing in and waiting for 10 minutes going through that? Or could we just have a list of questions, Q&A up there? So we were trying to use more web support, use more technology, use more automated solutions to improve the response time of the contact centers. So those are some of our lessons learned. If we talk about specifically for non-financial risk, one of the things that obviously that we are beginning to talk about in the industry, and I participate in the industry group ORX, so all the other banks are beginning to ask this. So really, is our traditional non-financial risk toolkit fit for purpose? I mentioned a little bit that it really wasn't reasonable or likely to think about doing an RCSA at that point in time. We needed to be much more dynamic and much more targeted and much more specific in the risks that we were looking at and thinking about how we were going to manage them, especially if we wanted to get out ahead of them. So what we wanted to do was be proactive and think and forward-looking and thinking about that. And clearly we have to think through that because as many of you may know, in operational risk, there's frequently a lag between the event and the financial impact, the operational risk loss. So what we're trying to do is avoid those operational risk losses. So we're trying to be proactive and going through that. And we just didn't find RCSA to be helping us to do that. What we were really doing was we were basing things on potential scenarios, and we were thinking about developing innovative ways of working and being much more dynamic and going through that. One of the things that I did find was obviously the experience of my non-financial risk managers was the best tool I could possibly think about to help mitigate potential losses and potential risks, right? So even though, for instance, the crisis in 2008 had a very different root cause and it was essentially a liquidity crisis, there were still some lessons learned that we could apply. So what were the lessons learned that we could apply? One of the lessons learned that we applied was that when in 2008, when in the U.S., the banks went to implement some of the government solutions for clients and customers, we had a whole host of documentation issues. So we didn't document it well. We didn't apply the programs very well. So clearly that's a risk that we're looking at, and some of the things that we've been working with the different teams. Are you making sure that you are applying the government program appropriately? Are you looking at the customers that are most at risk? Are you, again, going back to simple personal affair, are you being responsible in the way you're applying? Are you actually being robust in your documentation of going through that and making sure that you're doing that? Because sometimes as you try to move quickly, your documentation falls through the cracks. Well, we don't want to do that. So we want to make sure that we're doing that, but at the same time, not taking a huge amount of time to implement these things. So these are things that we were applying and going through that, or other things like as we're working with our wealth business saying, okay, are you actually working with clients in the private bank and looking at their portfolios and making sure that we're managing those portfolios well? Are we in good contact with our clients? So these are things that we apply from experience in the past. So that's some of the best ways of looking at that and determining the potential scenarios that we could work through. So obviously, we're trying to be more forward-looking. But what does this mean for some of our traditional tools? What does it mean for our historical losses? Because we've never really had a situation like this. And one of the things that we're talking about in the industry right now is what are we going to consider as an operational risk loss due to COVID? Are there losses that we're going to consider due to COVID? And are historical losses a good proxy for our future risks? Some are, in some cases they're not, right? So like I said, we're taking very more targeted and specific focus areas and looking at the different risks and how we want to manage them. Not necessarily we're looking at the entirety database of all our historical losses. We're being much more surgical in really thinking about, is this type of loss a good proxy for what could happen or what's going to happen? So we're really looking through that. And then, of course, I mentioned RCSA. Is it really still a useful tool? And what does this all mean for capital? If we use historical losses to determine our capital, but historical losses aren't really a good proxy for a pandemic situation like this, what does it mean necessarily for our how we hold capital and how we consider capital in the future? Going through that. And then, obviously, we're going to be relying much more on scenario analysis and really thinking through our scenarios. And then, do we really need to think about our new risks and new taxonomies? Is it constantly evolving? So these are things that we're thinking through. These are things that we're thinking through with other banks. We're very much aligned with other banks and what we're thinking through is with ORX. And like I said, there's really not much that can replace the experience of my op risk managers who have gone through other situations and seen things. And that's really where we've added value for the business and what we've put together, right? So in thinking about how we can enhance controls, how we can manage the situation better, and how we can get out in front, and we've been very quick in putting together that guidance. And then even if it's nothing written, we've been having calls and helping them think through all these things in the different aspects going through that. So to wrap this up, before we go to questions, really I'm going to ask the industry is the toolkit that we have to manage operational risk fit for purpose, and what kind of adaptations do we really have to make, particularly applying the lessons learned from COVID that we've had as we go through this. And this is obviously a situation that's going to continue to evolve, and we're going to continue to apply and have lessons learned. Okay. So with that, I'd like to pass to Eleanor to questions. I believe there are some questions out there, but if you haven't had a chance to submit a question, please do. I encourage you to ask any questions that you have. As you can see, I've built in about 15 minutes for questions. So I encourage you, if you haven't had the chance to submit a question, to please do so. So Eleanor, with that, I'll pass it over to you to hopefully you'll help me with the questions.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Andrea. That was really interesting. Yeah, I've got a question here from Dennis Weathers. Thank you, Dennis, from NIBC Bank. He's asking, how do you ensure you keep a certain social coherence in your staff when everybody is working remotely?
How do I ensure I keep a certain social coherence to my staff? Well, so part of it, I think, as I said, was doing the weekly calls and encouraging them to ask, any questions that we would have going through there and working through that. In addition to, we had quite a few other touch points. So one of the other things that we do is we do brown bags, where we zoom in on a particular topic. And obviously we used to do those, physical presence brown bags, but we started doing those remotely via webcast. So making sure that we were doing deep dives on particular topics or particular things, going through that. A lot of it was communication on what we were communicating. I was also, had my direct reports that were having constant contact with their staff, and then I was I'm having a weekly meeting with my staff, with my direct reports, and going through and making sure that we're looking at that, going through that. So from that perspective, it wasn't really that much of an issue to have social coherence from my team. I think we are all very much aligned on what we needed to get done and what we needed to go through. And if I was worried about anybody in particular, I would call them just directly or have one of my staff call them directly and touch base with them. So it was, I think it was just making sure that we were in constant communication, even if it had to be remotely. So going through that. Dennis, I also see you asked about Zoom. Sorry, Eleanor. I'm advancing a little bit because I see that he asked about Zoom.
No, please do. Yeah, interesting.
So yes. So Dennis, yes. So that's actually a very, very good question. We were using Zoom in the beginning, and then obviously we started to get concerned about that, and we migrated to Teams. So we use Teams now as opposed to Zoom. When we do have to use Zoom, we've implemented some additional controls in space, and we did check on a number of things in Zoom in that, for one, Zoom goes through all our internal bank servers and goes through VPN. So we were protected. It wasn't out there in the open. Then we made sure that we implemented some certain controls, like for instance, we've got people in who controls the waiting room and lets people in through the waiting room and verifies the identity and the actual person that comes in. But we really minimized the use of Zoom. Okay.
Perfect. I've got another question here,
okay.
Andrea. Did you log an operational risk event for COVID-19, and what drivers did you include in the operational loss estimation?
So we have had very few COVID-related events, things that were specifically COVID-related. We had a small event, as I mentioned, that was due to a process and execution error because some things had to move a little bit more slowly. So those things were clearly identified as COVID just because the process was slightly different. But in general, we've had very, very few actual COVID-related events. And what we are doing is we have put in place what we call a COVID flag in our internal loss database system, because the root cause may still be an execution error, but we're putting a COVID flag to show that that's related to COVID. Outside of that, until we get further guidance and get more agreement in the industry, we have asked all the businesses and the countries to specifically track and log additional expenses that they're having related to COVID. So, for instance, the cost of masks or hand sanitizers, which is clearly an increase in cost, we're asking them to keep track of that so that we don't have to go back and get that information, so that we can say, okay, yeah, this was definitely a COVID-related expense, and then when we get the better guidance and agreement in the industry and determine what we're going through, we'll be able to clearly identify that. And I think we are getting to some consensus in the industry, and I know ORX is really trying to lead the charge with Oliver Wyman along this line. So things like the masks and the hand sanitizer and those types of things I think are clearer. The things that are less clear, and I have a very particular view. I don't think that we should, investments that we made in our technology that we're not going to undo and that are just an acceleration of our technology strategy that we would have invested anyway, I don't believe that that's a COVID expense because we're not going to undo that. And we would have spent the money, it's just 6 months from now. So we accelerated and we spent the money now, and we're not going to go back. So those are things clearly an investment that we had. There's also some debate in that, our CEO mentioned yesterday that our costs are down in Santander, and that's very clear that our costs have gone down because we are not traveling right now. But there doesn't seem to be, the guidance that ORX is saying, no, that's an opportunity cost that doesn't count. Well, why doesn't it count? I think it should count. That's a benefit. Why are you only looking at the negative side of things where we spent money, where we saved money? That should count. And we haven't spent money on travel and going through doing that. So I've asked us to consider that part as well so that we can keep track of that. So we are keeping track of those types of things to go through, because like I said, it's easier for us to gather the information now than to go back later and get it. If then we don't consider it, at least we have the information and we can do other types of analyses, and I'm sure our cost organization, our accounting, our controller organization will be very glad to have the information in one way or another for other things that they need it for, right? So I think it's of a benefit to have that information anyway.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Andrea. We've got a question here. From sort of what you discussed, what would you say is the biggest challenge you faced, if you had to say?
I think the biggest challenge that we face, that's a tough question because there were a couple, right? I think one of the biggest challenges was adapting the protocol that we established for local needs and really being thoughtful and careful, but moving quickly on that, right? Going through that, as I said. In some cases, we had the benefit that, Mexico went into had the situation going later than us, so we were able to benefit from that hindsight and really think through it. But I think the really bigger challenge is the return to work challenge, and really thinking about just how things have had to change and going through that, and making sure that we still maintain those three principles as we return to work, right? So protecting our employees, protecting our customers, and also providing them with the services and the things that they need and providing them quickly, right? Not making them go through bureaucracy and administrative hurdles and going through that and being responsive to our clients. And then the third one is managing the risk as we return to work, because now all of a sudden, it's almost easier to identify the new risks that you're going to have as you quickly go to work from home. Now we have to think about the risks that we're going to have as we return to work and going through that. So I think and striking that balance, I think is really a big challenge, and I think it's a challenge that we are, not just us in the industry are facing, but all over the world we're facing that challenge as we go back to work.
Yeah, no, most certainly. Okay, and I think you actually just touched on this, but I've got a question about, just in case there was sort of any other benefits. Got a question here. So were there any benefits from the situation that you'd face? I know you touched on a couple, but any sort of others that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, I think it's one thing we've learned that we can work much more efficiently. As the CEO of AstraZeneca said, we can definitely work more efficiently, and that we can move faster on things. If there is clarity in the objective, I think we can move very quickly. So one of the things that we were talking about in our leadership meeting is that we have to be absolutely sure that we have clarity in our objectives, because that's tremendously helpful for all of us. We can all put together and move quickly. So I think that's been a benefit in identifying that. The other benefit is, like I said, it's really accelerated some of the things that we wanted to do. So it's accelerated some of our technology. We've automated some things that we knew we needed to automate, and we've gotten a benefit from that. We are putting together, like I mentioned, we've put together a list of really good practices and best practices that we have across the globe, so that we're going to share that with other countries because it shows it can be done. Another benefit is, we've learned of automation. So we know, we can certainly automate better and be more efficient in going through things. So we can definitely think about things that where we didn't think we can automate, we can definitely automate going through that. And we also know that we can work from home. right? So there was always a little bit of reticence or people thinking that people didn't work efficiently from home. I think we've proved we can. And that we've also proved that we don't necessarily have to travel as much, right? So that's another thing that could be of a benefit, that we don't always have to go, that we can get a lot done. I think we're still going to need to travel from time to time to do our business, but we can still get things done virtually and remotely as we go through. So I think these are all things that are benefit, and that we think through about, you know, how we actually work is going to be a benefit from that.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for that. Okay, I think I've got there's one last question here. Just a reminder, we just have a few minutes left, so if anybody does have a last-minute question they want to put forward to Andrea, now is the time. But I do just have another question that I want to ask you, Andrea. How do you think through and identify the different potential risks that increased?
So as I mentioned, I think it was much more scenario-based and really thinking about individual different risk profiles and thinking about that aspect. And also, as I mentioned, really thinking through your past experience, saying, okay, so the last pandemic, the last, H1 scenario wasn't maybe necessarily what we have today, but what can we take and still apply? Or like I said, in the 2008 crisis, that was a very different crisis with a very different root cause, but there were some things that we could take and apply and lessons learned, saying, okay, so this I can see still being a concern, or this I can still see going through and being a worry, and thinking about that. So one of the things obviously that we're thinking about right now is, as we start applying these government programs, we want to make sure that we're applying them appropriately, and with the intention of how the government sent it out, with its intention. Because what we don't want is then to have a suitability or conduct risk problem later on, right? So we want to make sure that we're going through and managing these things appropriately, applying those lessons learned in the past and applying the experience. So you have to almost go different types of risk by risk, or even going through and saying, okay, we've got people working from home. How do we make sure that we don't have data leakage working from home? Or we have traders working from home where traditionally we don't have them working from home. Do our controls that we have in place, are they still applicable? Do they still apply to make sure that I don't have an unauthorized trading event? So I can tell you, I have a friend of mine who works for another bank, and I was asking him, he's a CEO of a trading desk, and he was telling me, in some cases, we've just really applied some some additional controls, in that we are literally going through each trader's blotter every day, transaction by transaction, and we're going through and doing that. It's cost an incredible amount of work, but we're making sure that we're applying extra controls, and we're putting those controls in place so that we make sure that we don't have additional risk there. So it's really thinking through very carefully certain types of risks and how that has changed, given the fact that maybe some of your traditional controls that you have in place may not apply, and what additional controls you need to put in place to cover those risks and to mitigate those.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Andrea. I think that sort of brings us now. We're coming towards the end of the webinar. So I just wanted to thank you very, very much, Andrea, for joining us today and for sharing a really interesting and very, very engaging presentation with us. So thank you for that. I also wanted to thank everybody who tuned in. Thank you very much for your questions. If you do have any feedback on today's discussion or any recommendations for future webinars, please do complete our short survey. It should flash up on your screen shortly. For the latest updates on RiskMinds events, both face-to-face and digital, please do follow the RiskMinds pages on LinkedIn and Twitter. But until we meet again, stay safe, everybody, and thank you very much. Andrea, thank you again.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone who joined today. Stay safe. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.